It can be incredibly annoying when other people try to stereotype or they try to pigeonhole you, to stick you in a box. When somebody else expects you to behave in a certain way or be a certain way for no other reason than it fits into their own ideas and preconceptions about who they think you should be. You stand there and very often think, hey, that's not who I am. The person that you expect me to be is not the same as the person that I am in reality. And it can be annoying and it can be frustrating, but it can also be deeply harmful. Jesus himself certainly wasn't one to get away without being pigeonholed or without failing to meet up with people's expectations. In our gospel reading today, although Jesus is referring to his own generation, he could just as easily be speaking of our generation today. They thought that John the Baptist was some kind of demon, and they accused Jesus of being a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Well, they weren't exactly wrong there, were they? Because interestingly, they describe Jesus not by who he is, but by the company he keeps, which unsurprisingly does not meet with their approval. But then again, Jesus never really was one to seek other people's approval. But the response of Jesus to them is interesting because he compares them to children. And small children, he suggests, would have more insight into the will of God than these grown men who seem more occupied with playing power games and with trying to catch him out. Because the Messiah, the one they've been longing for and waiting for so long, is right there in front of them, and they fail completely to see beyond the superficial appearances of both John the Baptist and Jesus. It's clear that Jesus knows exactly who he is, in the way that he addresses God as his Father. He's confident and he's secure in his own identity, but can others see him for who he truly is? Well, to be honest, it's looking rather doubtful at the moment, because they completely misunderstood who Jesus was or what he was all about. They based their judgments on nothing more than their own preconceived prejudice. How often, I wonder, are we misunderstood? How often are we characterised in ways which don't really describe who we truly are, but instead fit into the narrative of the person who's making the judgment about us? The frustration of having somebody assume they know all about you, based upon where you grow up, or what school you went to, based upon your gender identity, your sexuality, or the colour of your skin. And people, they jump to all sorts of conclusions based upon these external attributes over which you have no control. And more often than not, those conclusions are wrong because they don't give us the full picture. None of these factors are able to truly capture the complexity of who a person really is. It's easy to jump to conclusions based upon a minimum of information. Yet stereotyping somebody in this way can have huge implications for them, whether we realise that or not. And those implications can range from violence to discrimination, from a negative self-image to getting stuck into a cycle of destruction. And it's disappointing and it's disheartening to be on the receiving end of somebody who isn't really seeing us for who we truly are. We might wonder, why don't they get it? Why don't they know who I am? Why don't they know who the real me is? But for that to happen in any meaningful way, there needs to be some kind of relationship which goes beyond the superficial. Time needs to be taken in getting to know one another, so that we are able to let go of our fixed judgments and truly learn and understand from one another. And so often we see that those around Jesus simply didn't get who he was. These great upstanding teachers of the law certainly didn't. And as we read the gospel accounts, very often those closest to Jesus, his own disciples, didn't always get who Jesus was and what he stood for. And these teachers of the law, it was them that were looking on in disgust as Jesus mixed with those who were very often deemed undesirable. The tax collectors, the prostitutes, the unclean. I wonder if Jesus was here now, would he be hanging around with a good, clean living church people? Or would he find more of a home with those who perhaps we often walk by ourselves in the street? Would he be more at home with the homeless, the addicts, the marginalised? And if he did, would we judge him on that? Because we build up an image of Jesus and who he is, which is based upon so many different things. From the gentle Jesus, meek and mild of our childhood, to the long, blonde-haired, blue-eyed way which we so often see him portrayed as in Western arts. And of course, that's nothing like how he actually would have been in reality. But it builds up a perception or a stereotype in our minds. But the challenge for us is to open our minds, open our eyes and our hearts and see the real Jesus. The Jesus who was a Middle Eastern Jew. The Jesus who was friends with drunks and prostitutes. The Jesus who breaks down barriers and who goes beyond closed minds and stereotypes to be with people where they are, as they are. Jesus called God Father, and he invites us to do so as well. And in doing so, we share something with him of what it is to know the will of God. We have an expansive, outward-looking God who fully understands rather than misunderstands each and every one of us, and who sees through the barriers of race, of gender, class, or whatever barrier we so often erect and then fail to break down ourselves. And when we enter into a relationship with God, we reflect something of God in our daily lives, in our relationships and our interactions with those we meet from day to day. And in doing so, hopefully, we become just a little more like Jesus each day. Amen.